You've always been the difficult one, my mother said, not even looking at me. Your sister figured out her life. Why can't you? I was standing in my parents' kitchen in Mississauga, holding tea I hadn't touched, watching her load the dishwasher like the conversation wasn't happening. That was her way. Say the worst thing, then turn her back, so you couldn't even respond to her face. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper folded in front of him, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. He cleared his throat. What your mother means is that we're worried. You're 31 years old, Hazel. You don't have a pension. You don't have benefits. You're renting a basement apartment in Kensington Market and calling yourself an entrepreneur. He said entrepreneur the way other people say delusional. I'm building something, I said. It takes time. My mother set down a glass too hard on the counter. Building what? You've been saying that for 4 years. Your sister just made partner. Your cousin bought a house in Oakville. What do you have to show for 4 years? I didn't answer. I knew what happened when I answered. I'd tried explaining once, maybe twice, maybe a dozen times over the years, and every time it went the same way. They'd nod, then ask if I'd considered going back to school. My father would mention a friend's son who'd gotten into Queen's MBA program. My mother would pivot to whether I was eating properly, which was her way of ending any conversation she didn't want to have. So I stopped explaining. It was easier. What I didn't tell them that evening, standing in that kitchen that smelled like the same lemon dish soap it had, smelled like my entire childhood, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had signed a lease on a commercial space in the distillery district. What I didn't tell them was that my company, the one I'd been building quietly for 4 years, had just closed a Series A funding round. What I didn't tell them was that 26 people worked for me full-time and that our annual revenue had crossed $4 million the previous fiscal year. I didn't tell them because I had tried once to show them. 2 years earlier, I'd brought over my laptop and pulled up our platform, tried to walk them through what we did. A project management tool built specifically for mid-sized construction firms. And my father had looked at the screen for about 45 seconds before saying, "But what's the actual product? What do you make?" And my mother had asked if I was sure I wasn't just working for someone else and calling it my own business. After that, I stopped trying. My name is Hazel Brennan, and I was 31 years old when my parents decided, officially and out loud, that I was the family's cautionary tale. It hadn't always been that way. When I was young, they'd called me their ambitious one. I was the kid who set up a lemonade stand and kept a spreadsheet of daily earnings. I finished high school 2 credits early. I got into the business program at McMaster, and they drove me there themselves. My mother crying a little in the parking lot outside the residence building. My father carrying boxes with his chest puffed out. But then I dropped out at the end of 2nd year. Not because I was failing. I was pulling an A- average. I dropped out because I had already started building the prototype for what would eventually become ClearHive, and I could see clearly. The way you can sometimes see things with a certainty that doesn't have much to do with logic, that if I didn't do it then, I never would. The window felt specific. It felt like something I'd regret. I told my parents over the phone because I knew what their faces would look like in person, and I wasn't sure I could hold steady through it. My father went very quiet, which was worse than shouting. My mother cried, and then got angry, and then cried again. Over the following weeks, they called relatives to ask if anyone could talk sense into me. My aunt drove up from Hamilton specifically to sit me down at a coffee shop and explain that dropping out was the kind of thing that followed you. But I had already made the decision, and I had already started building. The next 4 years were not glamorous. I'm not going to tell you. I hustled my way to success, and it felt amazing every step of the way, because that would be a lie, and anyone who's actually built something from nothing would know it was a lie. There were months where I paid myself nothing and covered my rent with a line of credit I shouldn't have opened. There were sprints where I worked until 2 in the morning and then couldn't sleep anyway because my brain wouldn't stop running through what I'd missed, what wasn't working, what I needed to fix by Thursday. There was a winter, the second one, where I genuinely wasn't sure whether to keep going. I kept going. The platform grew. Slowly at first, then faster. We picked up our first real client, a mid-sized contractor in Brampton. And then their recommendation got us a second, and then a third, and suddenly we had a product that the industry was actually talking about. I hired 2 people, then 5, then 15. I moved out of the basement apartment and into a 1-bedroom in Trinity Bellwoods, which felt, at the time, like the most extravagant thing I had ever done. My parents knew none of this. They knew I was still doing the tech thing, and they had decided, at some point, to wait for me to grow out of it. The dinner happened on a Saturday in October. My younger sister had just passed her bar exam. She was a lawyer now, working at a firm downtown, and there was a celebration dinner at my parents' house. Extended family came. My aunt and uncle drove in from Hamilton. My cousin and her husband were there, fresh from a trip to Portugal, showing photos on an iPad that kept getting passed around the table. It was fine, at first. It was nice, even. My sister deserved the celebration, and I was happy for her. She'd worked incredibly hard, and she was good at what she did. And I'm saying that without any complicated feelings attached. Because it's true. The complicated feelings came later. We were on dessert. My mother's butter tarts, which she made from scratch for every family occasion. When my uncle leaned back in his chair and looked at me. "So Hazel," he said, in the tone of someone who had been holding the question all evening, "what are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, my father jumped in. "She's still doing the startup thing." He said it the way you'd say she's still doing the gluten-free thing. Tolerant but unconvinced. My mother passed the butter tarts in my direction. "We keep hoping she'll find something more stable." I felt my cousin's husband glance at me, with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. "There's nothing wrong with stability," my uncle said helpfully. "I've been in insurance for 30 years. Good pension, good benefits. Nothing wrong with knowing what your paycheck looks like." "Hazel's always been the risk taker," my sister said, not unkindly, but in the way you say something when you're trying to soften something else. My father set down his fork. "The thing is, at some point the risk has to pay off, doesn't it? Your sister's been building something real. A career with a future, a reputation." He paused. "I don't say this to be hard on you, Hazel, but we worry. You're not 22 anymore." "I know I'm not," I said. "What's the actual plan?" he asked. "If this doesn't work out, what's the plan?" "It's working out," I said. He looked at me the way he looked at the weather forecast when he didn't trust it. "You've been saying that." My mother reached over and patted his arm. "We just want you to have options. A degree gives you options. Experience at a real company gives you options. Right now, if things fell apart tomorrow—" "They won't, but if they did." She left it there. My uncle refilled his coffee. "You know what the problem is with the startup world," he said, warming to his subject now, "is that everyone thinks they're the exception. Everyone thinks they're the one who's going to make it. But the statistics, Hazel, the statistics are brutal. 90% of startups fail. 90%. "I know the statistics," I said quietly. "Then you know," he said, as if that settled it. My father leaned forward then, and what he said next is the part I won't forget. He said it calmly. "The way people say things they believe are facts. You had real potential, Hazel. You were smart. You could have done anything, and instead you've been spinning your wheels for 4 years with nothing to show for it. I don't know what else to call that except wasted." The table went quiet. My sister looked at her plate. My cousin's husband studied the butter tart in his hand. My aunt looked like she was calculating whether to intervene. Wasted. That was the word he used. Not wasted potential. Me. I was the wasted thing. I looked at my father for a long moment. He didn't look away, and then I did the thing I always do. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I folded my napkin, set it next to my plate, and said, "Dinner was lovely. Congratulations again." To my sister, I said, "I mean that. I'm really proud of you." And then I got up, got my coat, and left. I drove back to the city on the 401 with the radio off. I wasn't crying, which surprised me a little. I thought I would be. Instead, I felt something more like resolution. Like something that had been uncertain for a long time had finally become clear. I did not call them that night. They did not call me either. The next 3 weeks were some of the best working weeks I'd had in years. We were preparing for our official launch in the new commercial space. A proper office now, with meeting rooms and a reception desk and a wall of windows that looked out over the brick buildings of the distilleries district. And there was enough to keep my mind full every hour of every day. I hired 3 more people. We brought on a client in Calgary, our first outside Ontario. We did a soft launch event that got a mention in a trade publication, which turned into 2 more mentions, which turned into a feature in a national business magazine that ran with a photo of me standing in front of the ClearHive logo. Looking, in the opinion of several people who texted me about it, like I was someone who knew exactly what I was doing. I moved into my new condo the 2nd week of November. I had owned it for 2 months. It was being finished when I'd been temporarily staying at my parents' house between my old place and the new one. Not that they'd known that. Not that they'd asked. The building was in the West End on the 14th floor, with a view of the lake on clear days that still surprised me when I looked up from my laptop. My parents had no idea about any of it. Then something happened that I had not planned for and did not see coming. My sister, it turned out, had been telling her colleagues about me for months. Not because she was proud. Or maybe she was, a little. But because she genuinely thought ClearHive sounded interesting, and she had mentioned it in passing to a few people at her firm. One of those people was a partner who specialized in commercial real estate law. His clients included 3 large construction companies. He had been looking for something exactly like what we built. He reached out to our business development team directly. He didn't know I was the founder. He only knew the product. He wanted to set up a meeting, a proper presentation, at our offices. He mentioned it to my sister. She mentioned it to my parents. My parents, who had never heard of ClearHive, had no reason to connect any of those dots. And so, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, my parents walked into our office in the distillery district because they had gotten a ride with my sister, who was coming to observe the meeting for the firm. I did not know they were coming. I was in our main meeting room with 2 of our product managers going over the pitch deck when I heard a soft knock on the glass. Our office manager, a cheerful person named Ren, opened the door partway. "Hazel? Your 10 o'clock is here." And she hesitated, in the way people hesitate when something is slightly unexpected. "There are a few extra people. Is that okay?" "Of course," I said. I came out to the reception area. My sister saw me first. She looked, for just a second, like someone who has realized they are in the middle of something much larger than they thought, and then she very carefully arranged her face into a neutral expression. My mother was standing next to her. My father was looking up at the wall across from the reception desk, where our logo was mounted in brushed metal letters, ClearHive, and below it, in smaller text, my name. Hazel Brennan, founder and CEO. He turned when he heard my footsteps. I've tried since that morning to describe the look on his face. The closest I can get is that it was the face of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic and finding that none of the numbers add up. His mouth was slightly open. He looked younger, somehow. Smaller. My mother had her hand over her mouth. I don't know how long we stood there. It felt long. The office hummed around us. Someone was on a call in the back. A coffee machine was running somewhere. Ren had diplomatically found something to do at her desk. Then I said, "Good morning. Why don't you come in?" It was not a question. The meeting lasted an hour and 40 minutes. I ran it the way I always ran client meetings. Directly, confidently, without preamble. We walked the partner through the platform, answered every technical question, discussed pricing and implementation timelines, talked about our client base across Ontario, and our expansion into the western provinces. My parents sat near the back of the room. I did not acknowledge them during the meeting. Not because I was being cruel, but because it was a business meeting, and I had a job to do, and other people in the room who deserved my full attention. Several times I saw, in my peripheral vision, my father lean forward slightly, as though what he was hearing required him to physically close the distance between himself and what was being said. My mother had her hands folded in her lap and she did not move much. My sister watched me with something I still think about. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. When it ended, the partner shook my hand and said he'd have his team follow up by end of week. His assistant collected business cards. People filtered out. My parents didn't leave. When the room was empty except for the three of us, my father walked to the window. He stood with his back to me for a moment, looking out at the cobblestone street below. Then he turned. "How long?" he asked. "4 years." He nodded slowly, as though he was counting something internally. "The funding round," I said, because I had decided on my drive in that morning that I was going to say it plainly. Without drama, without making him dig for it. It was 4.2 million in Series A. We have 29 employees now. We're profitable. My mother sat down. She didn't say anything. She just sat down in one of the meeting room chairs and looked at me. "Why didn't you tell us?" my father asked. I had thought about how I would answer this question if it ever came. I had rehearsed it in the shower, on the subway, on long walks in Hyde Park, where I sometimes went when I needed to think. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, and I knew I wanted to say it without raising my voice, because raising my voice would mean I was still trying to get something from them, and I had decided I was done trying to get things from them. "I did try to tell you," I said. "Twice. Once at the kitchen table, with my laptop, when I walked you through the platform, and once on the phone, when I told you we'd signed our first corporate client." I paused. "Both times you changed the subject within 5 minutes. My father opened his mouth. "I'm not saying it to blame you," I said. "I'm saying it because you asked why I stopped telling you. That's why." After a while, it felt more honest to let the work speak for itself. My mother looked at her hands. "We didn't understand what you were building." "I know," we thought. "I know what you thought." My voice was steady. I had worked hard to make it steady. "You thought a degree was the only evidence that something real was happening. That if you couldn't see a title or a paycheck from a known company, it must not exist." I let that sit for a second. I understand why you thought that. But it wasn't true. My father looked around the room, the large monitor at the front, the Clear Hive branding on the wall, the city outside the window. "Wasted," he said, half to himself. I said that. "You did." He sat down across from my mother. For a moment, he looked like someone I recognized from a long time ago, before the comparisons and the dinners and the carefully deployed newspaper articles about other people's children. He looked tired. I was wrong. He didn't add anything to that, which, I thought, was probably the right instinct. There wasn't much to add. My mother said my name. Just my name, quietly, like it was the beginning of something she hadn't figured out how to finish yet. "You don't have to explain," I told her. "Neither of you do." And I meant it. I had stopped needing the explanation sometime around the second winter. The hard one. When I'd had to decide whether to keep going, and I'd made that decision entirely alone. Without them. Without anyone's approval or understanding. Somewhere in that winter, I had stopped waiting for them to catch up to where I was. And it turned out that once you stopped waiting, the waiting stopped hurting. My sister had appeared in the doorway at some point. I hadn't heard her come back. She looked between our parents and me, and then she said, very quietly, "I knew something was going on. I just didn't know what." "You should have told us," my mother said to her. "It wasn't mine to tell," my sister said. I looked at her. She gave me a small nod, the kind that doesn't require any words, the kind you can only give someone you've known your whole life. I nodded back. My father stood eventually. He straightened his jacket in the unconscious way he always did when he was collecting himself. "We owe you an apology," he said. "Both of us. I know, I mean a real one. Not just." He gestured vaguely at the room. "I know what you mean," I said, "and I accept it." I paused. "But I want to say something first, and I want you to actually hear it." I waited until I had both of them looking at me. "What you said at the dinner. What you've been saying for 4 years, it didn't stop me. I want you to know that. I kept going anyway. But it wasn't nothing either. It cost something. And I needed you to know that it cost something. Neither of them said anything. Okay, I said. That's all I needed to say. My mother stood and crossed the room and put her arms around me in the way she used to when I was small, before I became the difficult one, before there were comparisons and career discussions and worried phone calls to relatives. She held on for longer than I expected. I let her. My father put his hand on my shoulder, briefly the way men of his generation do, when they mean something they don't have words for. We didn't resolve everything that morning. We weren't suddenly a different family. There was still, somewhere underneath all of it, the 4 years of dinners and comments, and the way my stomach used to tighten every time I drove down the 401 toward Mississauga. That doesn't dissolve in one conversation in a meeting room, no matter how many millions you have in the bank. But something did shift. My sister walked them down to the lobby while I went back to my desk, because we had a product sprint call at noon and 3 client emails I still hadn't answered and a new hire starting on Monday, whose onboarding schedule I needed to approve. Ren knocked softly on my office door about 20 minutes later. You okay? Yeah, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. Not in a triumphant way. Not in an I told you so way. Just solid. Like something that had been slightly off balance for years had quietly, without ceremony, found its footing. I went back to my emails. The partner from the law firm sent over a letter of intent 5 days later. We signed a 12-month contract before the end of November. It was our largest single client to date. My father called on a Sunday evening in December. He didn't mention the office visit directly. He asked about the business, haltingly at first, then with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He asked what the funding process was like. He asked how I'd found my first employees. He asked whether the construction industry had been hard to crack, or whether there was already interest when we approached them. I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, and I answered every question. At the end of the call, he said, I should have asked these questions 4 years ago. You should have, I said. Not harshly. Just honestly. I know. We talked for another 20 minutes after that, about nothing in particular, my sister's new case. My mother's pottery class, which she'd started taking at a community center in Port Credit. Whether I was coming for Christmas. I said I'd think about it. I went, in the end. It was fine, mostly. A little awkward, a little careful, like everyone was handling something fragile and hadn't agreed yet on how. But there was a moment near the end of the evening when my father asked if I wanted to tell them more about the expansion plans. We were looking at opening a small satellite office in Vancouver, and my mother leaned forward and said, Yes, tell us, and I did. I told them for almost half an hour. My father asked good questions. My mother took out her phone at one point to look up something I'd mentioned and showed him the screen. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the version I'd sometimes imagined in the hard years, the version where they understood and believed, and it made everything feel lighter. But it was something. It was a start. And here's what I know now, from the other side of all of it. The validation I'd wanted from them. The acknowledgement that I wasn't wasted, that I wasn't throwing my life away, that what I was building was real. I had already built that for myself. I had built it in the second winter when I decided to keep going. I had built it in the Brampton contractor's office when he shook my hand and said, Let's do it. I had built it in every hire, every product sprint, every difficult call and long Thursday, and decision made without a safety net. By the time my parents walked into that meeting room, I didn't need them to tell me I'd made it. I already knew. The thing I'm still learning, if I'm honest, is that knowing that doesn't make you stop wanting it a little anyway. It just means you no longer need it to move forward, and that, I've come to think, is the whole point.